Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for an episode of Clean Water Casting. These are podcasts sponsored by FloridaRightToCleanWater.org, the organization behind efforts to establish a fundamental right to clean and healthy waters for all Floridians. I'm Joseph Benazia, Communications Director, and in this series, we delve into water quality issues in Florida, speaking with experts who can help us understand these issues and what we need to do to return our waters to health. Our guest today is Mr. Gil Smart. Gil is Executive Director of Vote Water and Policy Director for Friends of the Everglades. Gil, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Joe. Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
So, Gil, what are the water quality issues in Florida that most concern Vote Water and Friends of the Everglades? Help us understand how they started, why they persist, how they impact people and wildlife.
Sure. So we tend to focus on Lake Okeechobee and then the northern estuaries, which is the St. Lucie River, the Caloosahatchee River, Lake Worth Lagoon. But really, the problems that we see there are, sort of endemic throughout the state, very similar to what we see in other impaired waterways. We've got Lake Okeechobee right now. There's a huge algae bloom forming on the lake. It's become an annual thing right around this time of year. Legacy phosphorus and nitrogen in the lake helps feed these blooms. Every single year now, we're at a point where you have big blooms on the lake. And if the lake needs to be, if it begins to get too high as a result of wet season storms or hurricanes or tropical storms or what have you, there's always the looming threat of discharges to the northern estuaries, to the Caloosahatchee, St. Lucie, Lake Worth Lagoon. If that happens when algae is present, it's bad enough when there's not algae present on the lake, okay? Because you get all this turbid water, nutrient-laden water flushed into the fresh water flushed into the estuaries of the brackish estuaries. It really plays havoc with salinity levels, causes all sorts of other problems. That's when there's not algae in the water. When there is algae in the discharges, what happens, or what can happen, is you have these huge, massive blooms explode into the estuaries, and you wind up with another, major crisis, perhaps even a lost summer like we saw here in the Stewart area in 2013, 2016, 2018. It's only a matter of time until we see another lost summer. It could be this summer. And the problem is, from our perspective, from Vote Water's perspective in particular, not enough is being done to combat this. We're seeing in recent years, we're seeing Florida's elected officials throw all sorts of money at the problem. There's this effort underway to provide funding to counties to do more septic to sewer conversions. There's all these clean water projects being built, but the problem is we're coming in. It's like, closing the proverbial barn door after the horse is gone. It's instead of doing what we ought to be doing in terms of tougher rules, tougher enforcement, standing up to the polluting special interests, we're not doing any of that. All we're doing is trying to clean the water later. And it's not working. If you look at the state's basin management action plans, which are sort of the marquee program to reduce pollution in a lot of these impaired waterways, most of them are failing. They're failing to meet pollution reduction goals, and there's no accountability. There's no real sense that they're actually going to begin succeeding in meeting those pollution reduction goals anytime soon. So we know we have a pollution problem. Not enough is being done politically to tackle it. In large part, we at Vote Water, and I can speak from the Vote Water perspective now, believe this has to do with the fact that political power, as in campaign finance, political dollars, are coming in huge chunks from a lot of the industries that are responsible for either the pollution or preventing, the real solutions to the pollution. We focus a lot on the sugar industry at Vote Water and Friends of the Everglades. Special interests shower so much money on our political system that it just makes reform virtually impossible. And we've at Vote Water in particular, continue to believe that there is a political solution. The Right to Clean Water campaign basically says, no, we've got to have a constitutional amendment here. We believe that we need to be applying pressure on all fronts, that sort of thing. And so that's why, that's what our focus tends to be. Friends of the Everglades also focuses also on what goes on sort of in the Glades region in a broader sense. Been very involved in the movement to get rid of sugarcane burning. by the sugar companies in the Glades region. And been involved in issues going on in Miami, Miami-Dade with Biscayne Bay, that sort of thing as well. But it all goes back to the fact that we've got sort of a problem with legacy nutrients in Florida in these waterways. We didn't do enough back in the day to prevent the waterways from getting polluted, and we're not doing enough now to really tackle it. We're not doing even close to enough now to tackle it. But there's a lot of people out there, a lot of politicians out there who want to pat themselves on the back for all the money we're spending on these clean water projects after the fact. The real financially efficient way to tackle these projects, or these problems rather, would be to do more upfront to prevent the pollution, but we're not doing it. So that's our crusade here at Vote Water and Friends of the Everglades.
Okay, a quick follow-up question. We are spending billions of dollars of taxpayer money for projects south of Lake O to clean up the water before we send it south. Are you saying that citizens should not be confident that these are going to solve our problems, that they're going to clean up the water?
I mean, at best, we have some significant concerns about how effective the vaunted EAA reservoir, Everglades Agricultural Reservoir, is going to be. We believe there are still some very, salient scientific questions about how good of a job it's going to do. But even if we accept the best case scenario that this crown jewel of the system is going to work as advertised, it's still not going to be enough. We know initially when the plans for the reservoir were first discussed, they were talking 60,000 acres, but the state was unable to find willing sellers. So we wound up going with a footprint of 6,000 acres for the reservoir itself, in addition to additional acreage for the stormwater treatment area. It's not going to be enough. Again, even in the best case scenario, we're still going to need more land to store and treat water from the lake before it goes south to the Everglades. It has to be cleaned to go south to the Everglades. So, I don't want to call it too little too late, but it's pretty late, and it's certainly not what we're doing now. However many billions of dollars we're throwing at this, it's not enough. It's not nearly enough. And the problem with throwing billions of dollars at it now is it requires so much more. It's going to require billions of dollars for a significant period of time. Can the feds sustain these funding levels over the course of 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? If we're ever going to get the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, SERP, completed, we're way behind. We're picking up speed because so much more has been allocated for it, which is great. I'm not talking down the fact that more money has been advocated, and there's a lot of great groups out there that have been advocating for this, which is great. It's great to pick up the pace of Everglades restoration, but we're pretty far behind. And again, if we're ever going to catch up, if we're ever going to complete SERP, we need these levels of funding over the long haul. And is that even possible? We've heard the term bandied about Everglades so like Everglades exhaustion. That's not the exact term. I'm having a brain cramp right now. But basically, Everglades fatigue. That's it. Okay.
Okay.
And so what that means is there's a lot of lawmakers out there who are beginning to say, well, no, wait a minute. We've spent all this money on the Everglades for the last 2, 3, 4 years, whatever it is. There's other projects that need funding. Why is the Everglades getting all these fundings when these other projects would? So ultimately, at the end of the day, there's just not enough money to accomplish all the clean water goals statewide. The pie has to be divvied up. Those of us who follow Everglades restoration can say, well, we've been luckier these past couple of years because we've gotten more money. And, Ron DeSantis deserves some credit for that. The federal government deserves credit for that. Can that be sustained over the long haul? Because it has to be. It has to be. That's the problem. So
a lot of folks are anticipating time when that water can go south. What happens if the water in the reservoirs and the water treatment areas doesn't meet water quality standards? Will they be able to send it south anyway?
Well, theoretically, no. Theoretically, it's got to be, I believe the average is 15 parts per billion across the STAs. I may be wrong on the exact figure here. 15 parts per billion of phosphorus in the water. In other words, the water has to be cleaned to a certain point before, and it's an average across several years and across the entire system of stormwater treatment areas here. but it's got to be clean. The bottom line is the water going to the Everglades has to be clean. If the system that we have now is not able to clean it to the extent it's supposed to, that's a big question, right? Are we actually going to be able to discharge this water? When you ask policymakers this question, when you ask, the South Florida Water Management District this question, you get responses like, it'll be clean enough because it has to be, or we'll achieve this goal because we must. I mean, I've heard some permutation of that. I must have heard it 25 times, over the course of the last couple of years. Well, are you sure that it's gonna be clean enough? What happens if we'll meet the goals because we have to? And that's basically the response that you get, which doesn't necessarily inspire a lot of confidence. Now, they are making some progress. The South Florida Water Management District, the stormwater treatment areas, in terms of their performance, in terms of how clean they're getting the water, they are making some progress. And we certainly hope that they are able to meet, obviously, we want clean water to go south. That's the goal. Water from the EAA, water from the lake. It'd be great if more water from the lake was sort of allocated space in these STAs, but we want clean water to go south. That's key to Everglades restoration, but it has to be clean. And again, the question is whether the existing infrastructure is robust enough to hit those targets. We only got a couple of years, and we're going to find out.
So, great deal of focus is on cleaning up before we send it south. You don't hear a great deal, and you did refer to it earlier, about sort of stopping the pollution at the source. We do have some pretty robust water quality laws and regulations and standards, but they are not being met. Mm-hmm. Why are they not being met? What's the issue? Is it enforcement, monitoring? What's going on? Because as you said, that would be the cheapest.
Right.
Best way to go about this.
So I'll give you an example. Lake Okeechobee Basin Management Action Plan. We are not meeting the 5-year, the 10-year goals, pollution reduction goals. So basically it's this roadmap as to a BMAP is essentially a roadmap as to how we're going to reduce pollution in these impaired basins. Okay. And, and it's very detailed if you actually look at the documents, and it talks about, here's where this pollution is coming from. Here's where that pollution is coming from. They've got all the, and agriculture is a huge source of pollution in the region, which makes sense, I guess. It's ringed by agriculture. But, the various cities and the various other sort of sources of pollution are all sort of cited. And then there's an amount of pollution they're supposed to reduce, their emissions or whatever it is, by these certain dates. And we're just not getting there. Okay. We're just not getting there, even though there's a lot of projects underway, and there's been some progress, which is great. Progress is great, but we're not making enough. So, but so the state's got this very, very detailed program. We got this great program, but we're not meeting the goals. So you ask, okay, well, what's the upshot of that? And the upshot of that is no one is held responsible for not meeting the goals. DEP, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, which puts together these BMAPs, they're not held responsible for it. It's basically like, well, we'll get it next time, well, we'll keep on plugging and we'll keep on doing more of these projects. And maybe someday we'll hit these pollution reduction goals. Well, that doesn't work in real life. You've got a deadline at work and the deadline comes and goes and you miss your deadline and your boss says, where's the project? And you go, well, I didn't quite get there. Maybe in another 5 months, I'll be finished with it. That ain't going to fly. But that's kind of how it works at the state level when it comes to pollution reduction goals, So we have, these great master plans that aren't working, okay, in part because there's no accountability. But then when you break it down even further, well, one of the big ways we're supposed to be trying to limit pollution in these impaired basins is via BMPs, best management practices. Okay, these are practices adopted by agricultural producers and others to limit the amount of pollution coming off their land, which is great. But here's the problem. We don't really do a lot of systematic testing to see for sure if we have like these models as to how much pollution these BMPs are supposed to, result in taken out of the watersheds. Mm-hmm. We don't do a lot of systematic testing to see, is the model correct? Is that actually what we're achieving? Are we actually achieving those numbers? There's an assumption of compliance. There's an assumption that all this works, and there is some testing, but then you get into these situations where you have a basin where there's multiple landowners, maybe multiple agricultural producers, okay, within the basin. And you can test the basin and you say, well, we're not hitting the goals here. There's too much phosphorus. So what do you got to do in that situation? You got to kind of go upstream and test at each of the individual producers' land, each of the individual farms. Well, where is this coming from? We don't do very much of that at all. And in part, that's because the DEP and the Department of Agriculture, when they get involved, don't have the resources to do that. They simply don't have the funding. They don't have the manpower to do as much of that as needs to be done. If I need to go upstream and actually do sampling on or right near the 10 different property owners, how long of a process is that? How many people does that take? Do we have the people to do that? We really don't. And so we don't have the resources to really follow up to the extent that we need to. We don't have the resources, or at least this is, one of the excuses. We don't have the resources to do the enforcement we ought to be doing. Given the problem that we have, we need to be very, very stringent about enforcement. There needs to be a whole lot more of it, but there isn't. Okay. And, again, I just articulated some of the reasons that decision makers will tell you that there isn't more. But the bottom line is we got a problem. We're not really cracking the whip, and we're at the point where we got to crack the whip, but we're just not doing it.
So what is the cost of all this in terms of human health to both sides of the state, to our wildlife, to local economies?
I mean, it's incalculable, but surely it's in the billions. Surely it's in the billions. It just, again, look at what's going on Lake Okeechobee right now. Right now, with the algae bloom that's growing on the lake, it's an issue for the lake. It's an issue for the health of the communities around the lake. You begin to see at some of these communities around the lake, the algae coagulates. We know that blue-green algae, there's research showing connections to neurological issues such as Parkinson's, such as Alzheimer's. There's ample reason to be very concerned about the impact of toxic blue-green algae on human health. And yet communities around the lake, as a result of these growing blooms, are likely to be exposed to this. People out on the lake may boating, fishing, whatever it is, may be exposed to this. And if we get discharges, if we get another huge explosion in the estuaries, all the people along the estuaries are going to be exposed to this. It's going to, we saw during the lost summers of 2013, 2016, and 2018, local tourism industries basically crashed. It became an international story. I saw papers from across the globe covering the story with pictures of our communities, our homes, just clogged with this terrible blue-green algae. What does that do to local hotel occupancy? What does that do to, people who want to do waterfront dining? What does that do to the people who rent kayaks for a living? It absolutely crashes all of those businesses. The city of Stewart here in Martin County has been in a lot of ways sort of a ground zero for a lot of these impacts. And is more in tune with it than a lot of other communities, has been very, very sensitive to these issues, thankfully, but because they've seen the worst of the impact. So there's a tremendous, and I'm just speaking economic impact here. There's a tremendous economic impact from this that ripples across a variety of industries. And again, as noted, the human health impact. I mean, we may see 10 years from now, because Parkinson doesn't develop like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sorts of things. We may see 10 years from now in these communities that have been affected by these huge algae blooms, we could see increasing rates of neurological degeneration, neurological problems, that studies might show at that point that, well, it could be traced back to this. We know that, there's going to be an impact across the board. And you would think that would ignite a sense of urgency in our lawmakers. And they'll say, well, it does. And that's why we're throwing all this money at these projects like septic to sewer conversions. Great, great. No one's saying that these projects aren't needed. What we're saying is it's like half the equation. The other half is the enforcement. The other half is the tougher rules and regulations. The other half is standing up to the special interests and saying, no, we're not going to do it that way anymore. But that's the part that's missing from all of this. And that's why we believe political change is necessary.
Well, I live in Cape Coral on the southwest coast, And we certainly felt like ground zero here back in 2018,
Absolutely.
2019.
The
Scary
red
stuff,
the
scary
red
stuff.
tide situation, the red tide over there, again, once again, international news, pictures of the dead sea life all along the coast. Who wants to visit that community? You know what I mean? That's not very inviting for a vacation, is it? People who are
No,
booking fishing trips months out in advance, they see that and they say, I ain't going there, that
no.
sort of thing. So,
Charter boats went uncharted, restaurants and bars were half filled.
yeah,
It was devastating for us.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So, we have these issues. Both Water and Friends of the Everglades are supporters of our Right to Clean and Healthy Waters initiative. You want us to talk to that just a moment?
It's time. It's time for that. We can't, again, we press for political change. We believe Florida needs better policy. Vote Water believes Florida needs better clean water policy and better clean water policy makers, because it's clear that our elected officials are not really committed to these causes, or are not committed to these causes beyond the causes of the special interests that fund them politically. So, but there's a case to be made that even as we're applying political pressure, we ought to be thinking beyond that. We ought to be thinking, okay, even political change takes time, and there's a way around this. There's a way, if we had a right to clean water, everything would change, wouldn't it? I mean, that's kind of the thesis here, that if we had a right to an enforceable right to clean water, it would force change. Okay, it would require change. So, we believe it's time. We believe even today, there's this sense among Florida policymakers that everything is fine. This is my worst enemy in this job. This sense that everything's fine. It's fine. Oh, it's going to be fine. It's fine. We continue with business as usual. It's not fine. It's not fine. Go out on Lake Okeechobee right now. It's not fine. Okay. And we cannot continue with business as usual. Well, we make that case politically, but for where it falls on deaf ears, then we need a right to clean water. You know what I mean? We need a right to clean water, because then there is no argument. Then the people have a right to clean water, which is a no-brainer if you think about it. What are you saying? We don't have a right to clean water? What are you saying, that we have to put up with this? That this is our lot in life? That, well, we're going to have to accept. We have to accept the algae. We have to accept these clean water crises. No, it's not. It's not acceptable. It's not acceptable in the least. The people do, and then people explicitly need a right to clean water. So we think this is a great campaign. We were supporters of it last year. We're supporters of it this year. We'll be supporters of it as long as we need to be. And we urge everybody out there who has not signed the petitions to do so. We urge people to get involved. We urge people where they can to contribute financially. It's a noble cause. Clean water, I often say, is a moral cause. Okay, we don't often think of it in those terms. We think of it in terms of politics. We think of it in terms of the economy. We think of it in terms of human health. Clean water is a moral cause. Where people have a right to clean water, they have a right to better health. They have a right to more prosperity. Okay, they have a right to life. Marine life has a right to life. Whereas without clean water, marine life can, as we've seen, as we just discussed on the beaches of Southwest Florida with the red tide event, marine life will just die. It is a moral cause. And again, it's one that we've been pushing for ever since it got on our radar screen, and we'll continue pushing for as long as it's there.
Thank you for that passionate, articulate defense of the amendment. I would just add that this is also super important for the rights of future generations, which not just ourselves currently that we're speaking about. It would enable us to hold our agencies throughout the state accountable for when they allow harm to our waters. Any last remarks you'd like to share with our listeners?
I would just reiterate what you just said about how this is all about future generations as well. I've got kids. My youngest are in their teens now. But if we don't do this, if we continue on the current path, by the time my kids are half my age, what are Florida's waterways going to look like? What is the situation going to be? And the answer is it's only going to get worse. Okay. We got enough of a problem with legacy pollution in these impaired waterways. We got a big problem with more pollution than supposed to be coming in, still coming in. Okay, we got to get serious. As I said earlier, it's not fine. It's not going to be fine. We can't continue with business as usual if we want change. Change is necessary. Change is not going to come via throwing a few, extra $1 million at septic to sewer conversions. Okay. That ain't going to cut it. We need to do more. We need a right to clean water, That would be a huge, huge step towards the lasting change that absolutely has to occur. So that's why we support it.
Gil, thanks for taking the time to talk to us today. To all our listeners, thanks for listening in. And that we will join us next week for another episode of Clean Water Casting with Florida Right to Clean Water.org. Have a great day.